Good afternoon, everybody. Troop T and Ed, are we ready to get started?
I think so.
Hopefully, everybody had a good week. We enjoyed listening to the community, and we've been working on some other ideas. So before we get us started, we want to look at the agenda. So make sure everyone's in line with this, and then approve the week 7 meetings from April 5th. So I believe Troop D is sending out a vote for approval of the minutes. Is that happening now? Electronically?
Maybe I have to stop the share. There it is.
There you go. So while that's happening, we've had some discussions about a couple more speakers coming on, and we're working on the schedule for the next couple weeks. And so we will be, we also will be adding a meeting May 10th. So everyone should put that on your calendars. And I'm going to turn it over to Ed to give the summary of the public input, and I will help moderate that with him, and then Philip will help on the second part. And then Ed, can you also give an overview of the conversations we've had about the additional speakers?
Certainly, Tony. So I think that you and Philip, the co-chairs, have had conversations with about adding 2 speakers to our agenda. Hopefully next week or the week after. One who will speak to issues of investment perspectives and building economics in order to provide the perspective of property owners and investors and some background on how investment decisions are made and what the considerations are. And the second speaker that we're pursuing is one who will be able to speak to renter and household budget concerns related to affordable housing and the challenges that renter households face in finding and maintaining affordable housing opportunities. And so those 2 perspectives will we are still arranging, and but we think that we may have those for you next week or the week after. So that's what we have in mind in terms of additional speakers. And because for that reason and for other reasons, we have decided to add an additional meeting for the task force itself. Originally, May 10th had been an off day for us, an off week. But we've decided to schedule a meeting for that Tuesday at the regular time, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so that we can be sure to have as much time as we need for the deliberation stage. So I don't know, Tony or Philip, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you've summarized it well, unless Philip has anything to add. But our goal is, as we've had, speaking to some, past committee chair members, is making sure that we get everybody's voices heard. And so we are going to be a little bit more intentional about making sure and talking to people to make sure they're either their voices have been heard or their perspective in other speakers. So we understand that we're adding to this, but from feedback that we've gotten, and we've heard that we don't want people to walk away from this thinking that they weren't able to participate. Councilman Tolbert, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Just kind of off this topic, I do think it is important to maybe clarify how are we going to utilize the expert practitioners that we have on this group to share some of their expertise. I just think it would be a disservice. We've heard a lot about what other cities are doing with rent stabilization or rent control, but we haven't necessarily heard what those different policies mean in practice. And I know we have people who have built new housing. We have people who have built new affordable housing. We have people who maintain continuing housing. That's something that I know, for example, I have never done any of those three things directly. And I think understanding all those things and how the different, like, for example, the survey that was sent out, how those things interact in a practical standpoint. We do have what I would call near experts on here, not in the field, practitioner experts who have been successful doing this. And how are we going to make the space available to actually learn, like, what does development finance look like? I would hate for this group to finish and only hear from what other cities are doing and people who study it but don't actually practice building affordable housing. Because at the end of the day, I know that's something that's a shared goal. It's like, how do we maintain affordable and housing? So what are you guys thinking on that?
So I can let Ed and Philip go afterwards. But so one of the things that we talked about is, we have experts on this committee, but we've been asking those experts to find counterparts to come in and speak so that it wouldn't be the community people. We just have 41 people telling only their opinions, but understanding, and I think that's where Tony B and Tramp were able to look at their networks on finding speakers to come in to be able to give those points of views, but not necessarily have the committee members. But again, we did hear that some people may want to speak directly. So we're working on how do we make more space to talk in here, more space in small groups, but also like I had a conversation with Tram this week, and she's working on bringing in a speaker to work on housing disparities and from the mindset of a renter. And I know that, we've been talking to Tony B as well to come up with speakers to talk about exactly what you said. So even though that he may have the expertise, figure out somebody in the public. So we can discuss whether or not it's the best option is to have the people on here speak or bring in external people speak to the same topics. Ed, would that be a summary of it?
Yeah, I would just ask Philip if he's got anything to add to that.
The only thing I would add is just appreciation to Kelly Elkin, who's another member of the task force, who's also working together with Tony Bronco on the investment and new construction speaker for next week or the week after.
So I think it's important that, like Chris, you mentioned, if they're topics that people feel like they want to speak about, or they're willing to find a speaker to come in to make sure that point of view gets across, or that level of expertise gets here so that we all have a general understanding, we need to put those forward. And then we are also working on how do we create more space for the people that on here that want to deliver the message themselves. Does that, council member, does that kind of clarify what we're trying to do?
I think it makes sense. I think just thinking about how we're going to do this, we've asked people to be on this committee and take a lot of time to be a part of it. And part of the reason a lot of people are on this because they're practitioner experts in this field. And so I'm hoping to hear from them. Granted, we want to get all perspective, we want to diversify perspectives and, like a lot of things, there's different perspectives, but we've asked, I think, high level experts to be on this committee. I think it'd be a disservice to not use their expertise since they're with us every week for 2 hours every week. So sounds like we're going to at least have a presentation, but I think we need to figure out how to make space for what these different potential policy decisions actually mean to people who are building housing or trying to maintain housing. Because quite frankly, I haven't gotten that out of here. I understand what Oakland's doing and that's a good basis, but I would like to understand how the policy choices that we make could affect positively, negatively, or in a neutral way the city in terms of maintaining, building both market rate and affordable housing. So that's what I'm getting at. Let's use the experts that we've asked to be a part of this.
Right, and I think the challenge for us initially was we wanted experts here to give an opinion based on speakers and the experts to help us get counterparts so that we weren't going to have, I think the challenge we thought was, and again, we've heard the same thing that you said, is like people want to be able to voice their opinion. Where if people are on the committee, if we go find an expert that is not a part of the decision making, it may be taken a little bit different than to have somebody give out their opinion and then negotiate with them later, and it may seem like it's coming from a personal viewpoint, or that they may have something more to benefit from it. So I guess the big question is do we just use only the people on here to give us their expert opinions, or do we ask the experts here to find us people in their field of work that they feel comfortable telling that story? But regardless, we need to make sure that everyone feels like they understand, we all understand all the implications about, like I just read, like how do we evaluate real estate, how financing works, how does, tenant turnover work, and all that. So we're open, and we'll take that back. And again, if others have an opinion on that, please let us know. The biggest thing that we're learning is every time we get notes and feedback about questions, we are trying to go back. And that's why Philip this week was having calls, and I was having calls with Tram to find experts to come on here to speak on that. But again, it may work as well as just having members speak themselves.
Okay, if there aren't any more questions or comments, we can move into the summary of the public input. I would note that I'd ask you to hold your questions. I don't know if there will be a lot of questions to the end of this, and we will have a comment. We will go from this summary of the public input into small groups. As you recall, of course, we instituted this public input phase so that you could get more information from folks who are not on the task force and use that in your deliberations. And so what we're going to do is summarize what we heard and then allow you some small group time to process this information, talk about it, and then we'll come back and report to the full group. I think that you received a full set of the comments that we received both in the Tuesday night public hearing as well as in the written form. And so you have all of the individual comments. And then what I'm going to do today is simply present the summary, which you were also emailed either late Friday or Monday afternoon. So that's what we're doing at this point. So just to remind everyone, we did have an open meeting on Tuesday evening, April 12th, and we heard from 37 different people. A few folks spoke twice, but there were 37 different individuals who spoke. And then we had a link available to the public that was open from April 5th through the end of April 15th, so 10 or 11 days. And we received 96 different comments, or we received comments from 96 different people in that written portal. And so that gives us comments from 133 different sources. And I will be summarizing those for you right now. And what we tried to do was to organize the comments that we got into the different kinds of program design choices that the task force has been considering over the last couple of weeks. And so you'll see how those are organized. First of all, I just begin with noting that there were 37 individuals whose major comment was simply to endorse the preservation of the program that was voted in by the voters in November of 2021. And the reason that I note that is because, of course, that position implies specific positions on rent caps and on other elements of the decisions that you have in front of you. And so we will incorporate those into the summaries that you have. So on the first issue of the rent cap, what you see in the upper right is simply the table that shows you how many people weighed in specifically on the rent cap. We got 84 people who spoke to that in one way or another. And of those 84, 75 of them supported a 3% cap. And as you can see in the table, you have the number 75. That's the number of people who weighed in with that opinion. And then the 89 is the percentage of all people who gave us some feedback on the rent cap, what percentage was associated with that particular position. So 75 supported the rent cap. 3 gave us feedback, which was not the 3% cap, didn't give us any more detail than that, but they were opposed to the 3% cap. And then you see there was individual opinions for setting the cap at the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is a measure of inflation. And one person wanted it set at CPI plus somewhere from 3 to 5%. And you can see the others down. The bottom one there was a person who simply wanted it, quote, tied to inflation. And there was no detail about whether they wanted that at exactly the inflation rate or some percentage of the inflation rate or above the inflation rate. But this was clearly a input for a variable rate. So you see the table in the upper right, and then what you see in the rest of this slide is simply the bar graph that provides the same information visually. We heard from 75 people on the issue of vacancy control and decontrol. And what we heard was 63 people expressing support for vacancy control. That was 84% of the responses that we received on this topic. 11 people weighed in support of vacancy decontrol. And one person suggested having vacancy decontrol for subsidized units. And so those constituted the 75 comments that we received on this topic. New construction. So many of the speakers spoke to the question of a new construction exemption, and 86% of those comments were opposed to a new construction exemption. 6 people made comments on what type of new construction exemption we should have. And I would note that all 6 of those comments were in favor of a rolling exemption, one that is pegged to the number of years, the age of a building, rather than setting the new construction exemption at a specific date. And so you can see that one person wanted a 3-year exemption, one suggested a 5-year exemption, and then 4 others suggested exemptions that were at least 12 all the way up to a 30-year exemption. So that's there wasn't a lot of input on the type of new construction exemption. But we did hear from those six people. We did hear about other forms of exemption. So remember in our earlier presentations, we talked about how some places exempt owner-occupied units and some exempt single-family rentals, and some exempt smaller buildings, usually 1 to 4 unit buildings. So we heard from a number of people on these issues. Regarding an owner-occupied exemption, all 60 people who spoke to that, either in writing or at our Tuesday night meeting, spoke against exempting owner-occupied units. 60 out of 62 of the comments we received on exempting single-family units were in opposition to that type of exemption. And then 62 out of 64 comments that we received about exempting small buildings were expressions against such an exemption as well. So again, you see the table in the upper right and the bar graph showing the distribution of responses in the lower left. And then the other opinions that we received had to do with banking and fair return. We heard from 15 people on the issue of banking, and 14 of the 15 were opposed to the idea. So remember, banking is that situation where if a property owner is providing preferential rents to a tenant, the question is, can they make up for that at some later point by banking the difference between what they are increasing the rent and what they could increase the rent under a rent cap. But 14 of the 15 people we heard from were in opposition to banking. On fair return, we heard from 65 people, and 63 were in favor of some process of fair return that would provide a way of property owners getting some exceptions to the rent cap. 2 comments were in opposition. That accounts for really the comments that we heard. Most of the speakers and most of those who wrote comments really did stick to the issues of policy design. I think in what was sent to you by email earlier, the summary also included a table that had a whole bunch of other types of responses that didn't fit neatly into the categories that we looked at right now. But all of that is in your possession and speaks to other elements of the decisions in front of you. So that is really the summary of the public input that we have, and what we're going to do now is sort of go into a breakout room to process this information. There is a link to a Google Doc that is in the chat, so that each group can write down their comments. There will be a staff member from Cura or a co-chair in each of the breakout rooms who will act as moderators. The first thing that the breakout rooms should do is identify a reporter, someone who will come back to the full group and talk about the discussion that was had by the small group. So, Richard, I saw your hand up a second ago. Did you have a
Well,
question?
maybe I'll wait till after the small groups. And if I still have a comment, I'll bring it up then. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Cecile. You're muted.
Just need 3 more years and then I'll stop doing that. The question, the second part of that is, how might these comments impact your work-life situation? I was confused by that. I just opened the link. And the first question is, the group is, what are your responses to the public input? How might these comments impact your work-life situation? Just to know how that was confused by the question.
Yeah, that's I was just noting something from Ed. I'll take that. I just mean, like, sometimes it might be in your role as a work, in your role as someone who works in the Twins in St. Paul. So if you're a building owner or property owner, if you're working in affordable housing, but that response also might be if you're living there. So that's kind of what I meant by work and life. It's just, it might, depending on your perspective, it might have different impacts. So and I think also the facilitators, as we go through these questions, those were just sort of placeholders there. So as we go through, you can diverge from that as your facilitation group works through the question. So that was just a starting point.
Right. Mainly, we want you to process the comments that you had. The idea was that these comments would inform your deliberations, and so we wanted you to have a chance to react to those, to process those with others, and that's really the point of the breakout groups.
And Ruthie or someone share the link to the slides that Ed just went through, so we have those accessible once we're in our small groups.
Sure. We'll work on that right away.
And then as I'm setting up these groups, I'm randomly assigning them. I think for people who are leaders, so the co-chairs and the Cura facilitators, I believe you should be in the room, we'll be in the main room for a moment until we get split out into breakout rooms, because then I'll manually assign you after everybody else is randomly assigned. So, so we'll start that process here. And then I think John Grebner, you'll just have to pop out of your room. So this is just the way that the creation happens. So I'm going to open the rooms and send people in. Okay.
Judy, you wanted us to come back to this room?
No, but I think you're in a room where there's nobody else with you, so you can pop back into your room.
Okay.
I think you're good in room 6. There's nobody else in there. I just want to make sure we have a facilitator in each person.
How long are we going to be in the group? I forgot that. Just want to make sure.
Let's call it 20 minutes.
20 minutes in small groups. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. Ed, can you
That may be more than enough, 20. But because I think that there's going to be a little bit more time needed in the report back.
okay, so 15.
Yeah, I would say 15 at most, and I'll send an email to John Grebner if any one of us should, if the conversations are lagging in the small groups.
Okay. And did you have like a Google link or something like that for the presentation?
I didn't.
Okay.
So who shall I? Who can I? Where should I send it so that somebody can put a link together.
Is it like a PDF or is it a PowerPoint doc right now?
It's a PowerPoint right now.
So I guess what I would just do is just get a PDF, and then if you just send it to us right now, people
Okay.
can pull a PDF from the chat here.
All
So
right.
all you have to do is PDF it.
All right, I'll do that right now. It's gonna. All right, so which group am I gonna end up in? Tripti, do we know?
Yeah, let me just see which one. See Terrence, you're in group 6. Tony. I'm gonna pop you into room 2.
Okay,
And then I can pop into room 1. See Terrence, you're in room 6.
Mhm.
And then Malik, I think we still need to assign you to a room.
is Malik here? Oh, that's Malik
Yeah,
Davis.
like Davis. I think room 5 looks kind of light, so maybe
Yep.
that one.
That'd be a good one. So,
And Trupti, if you give me the ability to assign folks, I can assign anybody that pops back in too.
okay, so hang on one second. Let me,
All right, so I've got an Adobe version of the,
Okay, if you PDF it, if you literally just put it in the chat, I think everybody will get it.
and how do I put it in the chat?
Put it on your desktop, and then there's like a little, looks like a piece of paper where you can search files or just find it, put it somewhere searchable, and then just pull it up in that little chat box.
Hang on. All right, should be there now, I guess. Can you see it?
Yep. Okay.
All right,
I'm gonna download it too, and then I'll be able to at least bring it to my group. But I think everybody should be able to see it too. Okay. I'm
All
gonna
right.
jump into my group.
And which group am I in?
You are in group 5.
Group 5, all right.
Yep. All right. See you soon.
It looks like we're all back from the small group discussions. What we'd like to do is give a chance for the reporters in each of the groups to have a chance to summarize the conversation that you had. So I'm wondering if the person so designated from group one would like to unmute themselves and give the full group a sense of what the conversation was like.
I joined the group late. Did we designate anyone?
No, you can talk if you want, or somebody else could.
Yeah, I can report back for group one. We talked a little bit about turnout and how, it was very apparent from what we saw, both in who attended but written, that the people who voted for the ordinance in November want to see that ordinance implemented. I think that there were, we kind of also agreed that we made it as accessible as possible, right? So just as we saw a lot of ISAM members, anyone engaged in this issue could have encouraged people to show up. And I think and what we talked about was the fact that so many renters showed up just shows that this is such a deeply impactful issue, that they're willing to, take the time out of their lives to engage in this public process, when we know that public processes and public comments have often been inaccessible or somewhat inequitable. And so appreciation for this task force in making the process for public comment as accessible as possible. I think there was some surprise that there were not more people who wanted to change the policy or had suggestions to change it. But a few folks in my group brought up a good point, which is that many of those people are currently at the state legislature trying to overturn the people's vote. So, maybe people are engaging in different policy spaces, but that doesn't take away from the fact that this was a good one, and that the public comment we received is reflective of how the people feel about the policy.
Okay, thank you, Trom.
Let me just add one more thing. I think Rich expressed some concerns about just when we look at the numbers of this, the numerical piece. Rich, maybe you want to speak to that a little bit?
You're muted, Rich, just so you know.
He hears for the 50th time this week, right? Just that, it's sort of presented as though this was, some sort of a balanced data collection kind of thing, right? I'm hearing from U of M researchers, this is not a stratified random sample. This is who showed up kind of thing. So just as far as when I look at public comment, I tend to look for information perspectives I did not see before, as opposed to counting the pluses and the minuses or the fors and against, because I don't think it's a very informative way to collect information. But there can be really good data in there, but it's not in the numbers. It's in is there a perspective I did not think of or see before? So.
All right, thank you, Richard. Can we move to group two?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Sort of talking about the impacts to work were some of the first things that came up regarding those who are managing assets. Currently are experiencing difficulty attracting capital to refinance and keep those assets in good standing. And that difficulty to refinance poses long-term risk for the asset stability. There is also some sentiments that this is really a one-sided conversation right now, and that the solutions need to be more inclusive of strong jobs or economic development initiatives to balance out the conversation by raising wages in real time for those who are experiencing the inflationary pressure points. We also have some comments from those in property management who talked about even if you end up finding affordability that first year, the rent increases can push people out even after that first year of affordability. And so how do we look at this more holistically, especially with families who won't see an increase in unit supply because of this? And so we did get a lot of points that were around the center on different sides of the conversation. We also had some comments around the labor markets in St. Paul have suffered because of this work or because of this policy as written right now, because they're not actively working on St. Paul projects that would have come down the pipeline. And so a smattering of different thoughts there.
Thank you, DeAngelos. Group 3.
Hi there, we had group 3. We all agreed we could have had a little bit more time with those results. We had the chance to review them, but it would have been nice to dig in on some people's commentary a little bit more deeply. A lot of emotion clearly from both sides, but had some good dialogue about everybody. It is a well-organized community, and that the renters have a very strong presence and good understanding of moving forward as a community and getting those voices heard. Speaking from a landlord's perspective, I tried to make some financial cases, and Cecilia as well, is that we have to keep investing in our community. And so there was a little bit of, I'm trying to voice the opinion of we're a 51% rental community. If we can get more people into home ownership, that we can really kind of keep the city moving forward. And we have so many impassioned people here. I think we all want safe, affordable housing, and we're all working for a stronger St. Paul. And we all want that. So to try to find a little bit more common bond would be very helpful. If anyone from group 3 would like to say anything else, I'd be glad to open the mic.
Yeah, I can for sure add to that. I think something that we also talked about is just the fact that we are trying to keep St. Paul as stable and as accessible as possible. And I think that when we're having a conversation about this, I think we need to really go off of the experiences of people who are experiencing housing issues in St. Paul. And I think sadly, there are too many times where renters and overall just like community members speak up and they're kind of shoved to the side as not being experts or like not knowing what they're talking about. And I understand that it can be very complex as a homeowner or a property owner or a landlord to be dealing with finances and just the housing stock and supply. But there's a lot of complications with being a renter as well. I know that there was a mother who was testifying about the fact that, she has more expenses than just rent, but rent takes over half of her check. So it's like there are so many different sides to each of these stories. And I think that everyone is an expert of their own experiences. And I just want to make sure that when we're talking about this issue, we're not making it seem like renters don't know what they're talking about, because I sadly have been kind of hearing those kind of motions a little bit. And I think that our state and government leaders are already not doing the best job of showing up for the community. And I think we need to start doing that for each other if they're not going to do it for us. So I just want to, if we're going to have a conversation, I really want us to be respectful of that, just because renters are experts of their community and we need to respect that. So that's just something that we talked about too.
Okay, thank you. Group 4.
I'll present for group 4. I was just in the kind of facilitator, note taker role. So other folks' comments, similar to what some other groups have reported on, that there's clearly well-organized and passionate advocacy for renters and from Isaiah in particular, and that there didn't seem to be a lot of property owner perspectives represented, and wondering about how the event was promoted or shared, and why that might be the case. We had some conversation about inflation and some more kind of the policy choices in front of us. And then the kind of second half of our discussion was really kind of pivoting into, so what does this mean for the deliberations of the task force going forward? How do we factor in what we've heard from this public input? And how do we make sure that we're balancing out the perspectives of all the different kinds of stakeholders who are here on the task force and needing to weigh in with recommendations to city lawmakers.
Thank you, Phil. Group 5, Tony.
Okay, our group was disappointed at the low turnout. There were comments about, who had time to come out with other responsibilities. People's opinions were not changed. They weren't surprised at it. Overall, like our group was a very mixed bag. Almost thinking like the overall sentiment of the group were, I think it was they're empathetic to both sides of the coin, understanding that they do believe overall in a policy, but they did not like this one. And how was it going to be less polarizing one direction or the other to come up with a situation? Because not everyone is going to agree on everything. And, where's the line where it's moral or ethical to make decisions that's not going to split the public? I think I kind of heard with my group that they're a little bit tired and frustrated. And most of our group kind of sat on the fence, but, wants dialogue and a solution that is going to come through the conversation as well. And Ed, do you have any other add to it? You were in our group and how you heard it.
Right now, that I don't have anything to add to that. Group 6.
I'm happy to. We didn't assign one, but if Group 6 folks want to come in and chime in too. I think it was generally a positive conversation. Folks feeling aligned with their community, given the public comment sort of aligned with what they're hearing from their neighbors and friends in St. Paul. But it's still some sort of careful consideration for how it allows for, and in one case talking about small developers or small property landlords can sort of account for cost to manage the property, as well as other concerns about the cap rate being ensuring that protecting renters, that it doesn't go beyond the growth in wages. And I think the other thing that it kind of came up was allowing for new development to be produced, given that supply has gone down over the past year. At the same time, demand continues to go up. And so generally a favor towards a new construction exemption, with sort of individual members' comments, each of those things. And so there's kind of a diverse perspective that we had in our group, but I think a generally positive conversation. And so, yeah, I don't know if any other Group 6 members want to add to anything, if I didn't represent everything that you said, or anything like that.
All right.
I think another thing I would add is that, like, when I talked about my situation as a renter in St. Paul, I talked about how much it would affect me, and where I'm able to live and survive and work.
Thanks, Robinson. Sorry for doing that.
All right, we're if there are no other comments, we're at a halfway point where I think we might want to take a 5-minute break and come back. The second half of our meeting today is to give you the feedback on the polling that we did. So you'll see where you as a group stand on many of the policy design issues that we asked about. This was the poll that we took a couple of weeks ago, right before the public input session. So why don't you take a couple minutes? My clock says 2:03. Can we come back at 2:08? So 5 minutes from now, and we'll resume. Thank you.
And I'm just going to switch computers. I'll be right back.
All right.
if folks are back, it's 2:08. We can either turn on your screen or somehow otherwise indicate you're here, so we know when it's okay to go ahead. All right, so before we dig into our second hour, which is focused on the survey results, one note we forgot to make at the beginning that about sort of what's coming up the next couple weeks that I wanted to turn it back to Ed for.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. I also neglected to mention that we finally have access to the market data for the St. Paul rental market that we had talked about earlier. And so we are in the process of trying to duplicate to the extent possible the kind of analysis of rents and rent increases over the last 15 to 20 years in St. Paul. I don't know how many of you saw the report that we created for the city of Minneapolis. We're going to try to recreate as much of that analysis as possible and be able to show you the distribution of rent increases in the city over the last 15 years and give you some information from that. So look for that in the next week or two. We're going to try to fit all of that information in as more fodder for your deliberations going forward.
Thanks, Ed. So I am really excited about that research being available to us to inform as we move into deliberations. So thanks for the people who are working hard to get it ready for us. So in a minute, we are going to look through the results from the fairly detailed straw poll survey that we all took a couple weeks ago. But I want to make a few comments on behalf of Tony and I before we dive in. First of all, just a very general summary. You might disagree with me or with Tony, but the general summary takeaway here, if you're not way down in the weeds of any particular policy, I think, is we have very complicated and nuanced views as a group about what the city should do. That's the general takeaway. And if it might seem to some participants in this group, myself included at times perhaps, that you have sort of people who are in one camp and people who are in another camp and it's all very clear lines, that is not what this survey shows us. It shows us a lot of surprises, I would say, and a lot of nuance and a lot of complexity in people's thinking. So I hope that as we dig into it together, we'll be able to really explore that. I think it sets us up well to be able to get into deliberations about the choices ahead of us and balancing all the different perspectives that are here. Another note, just to remind people, I think you filled out the survey, you remember this. We kind of artificially isolated each policy decision with each question. And I think a number of people from all sorts of different stakeholder perspectives pointed out as we were doing that, well, that's not the way you would want to think about this. You want to think about these in combination. And so we should also take what we see here as just a starting point. It's just a straw poll and it was artificially separated. As we go forward, we're going to have to think about which things combine with other things. And it's going to be a little more complicated to navigate than what we did in this exercise. When we were starting this process, the very first meeting, Mayor Carter talked about a couple of recent groups in the city that had done work kind of similar or analogous to what we're doing. And one of the groups that he mentioned, the kind of most recent one, was a group called Community First Public Safety. That commission met in 2020 and 2021, I believe. And they brought together a really diverse group of stakeholders to talk about issues that are, if anything, even more divisive and charged than the ones that we're talking about here. And they were able to reach strong majority recommendations on a number of changes that the city very quickly took action on. And so he mentioned that as kind of a model for us. As we have been meeting over these last few weeks, we've been looking at the work that they did, talking with the people involved. And so we just want to say a little bit before we present the straw poll results, kind of what the process is going to look like from here, now that we pivot over the next couple weeks into deliberation. So basically, we're taking the success story of the Community First Public Safety Commission as a framework that we can use for the purposes of this task force. That means digging into a number of these policy questions in small groups in more depth than we've been able to so far, looking at what do we think is best for St. Paul, and then voting together on recommendations, which again, we'll need to find ways together to package things so that they're not artificially isolated, because we know different of these pieces impact other ones. Ultimately, the decision makers on what the city is going to do are the elected officials of the city, the city council, and the mayor. But they've asked us for our recommendations and our input, and obviously are taking that seriously. So when we vote later in the process, as we get towards the end of June, we will present all of the results of those votes to the city council and to the mayor so that they can look at exactly what was the percentage that voted for any one of the different things that we end up voting on. But we'll use two thresholds for recommendations that are identical to the ones that were used by the Community First Public Safety Commission. Anything that gets over 60% of this very diverse and very large group of stakeholders will be in the category of a recommendation of the task force. So it's more than a strict majority, but it is not a lot more than a strict majority. And when you see the straw poll results, you'll see probably a lot of things can meet that threshold. We'll see. Then the other threshold that the Community First Public Safety Commission used to show that some things are not just a majority or a strong majority, but near consensus, is anything that would get over 90%. And so in their case, they had some things that reached the 90% threshold, a much shorter list, and then a longer list that reached the 60%. And both of those were presented with the idea that there is a real difference between something that's 90% or higher and something that's north of a majority, but not nearing consensus on such a diverse group of stakeholders. Again, the numbers will be there. So ultimately it's up to the city council and the mayor to say what's 82 mean versus 65, but those just were useful in their experience as ways of summarizing and categorizing the recommendations. So that's a lot of preface to then dig into the polling results, which I hope you'll be as engaged by as I was. We are not going to take comments during the presentation because we're all going to have a million comments, I think. We're going to take any clarifying questions during Ed's presentation of the results and then go into small groups so we make sure everybody can talk and we get that reflected just as we just did in the last exercise, and then we'll come back to the large group again. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ed.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. So let's go through the results of the polling without much further ado. The very first question that we asked you was, should the rent cap be fixed or variable? And so what you see is the bar chart here of the responses that we received. You can, and in all cases in this slide and in all of the future slides, we've included the actual percentage of the respondents in the most numerous response category. So we see here that 2/3 of the responses to this first question is that the rent cap should be variable and not fixed. The next question we asked, remember we said, regardless of your answer to the first, we want you to assume it's a fixed cap. And if so, what should the actual percentage be? And you can see that under those circumstances, 41% of you felt that it should be 3%, as in the ordinance. And then the next largest group felt that it should be set at a level more than 5%. So you can see the distribution of responses there. The third thing then is, the third question was, we asked you to assume that the cap was going to be variable, right? And so then we asked, how should it be determined? And here you see that 41% of you suggested that it should be tied to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, index, which is our measure of inflation, but it should be less than the CPI. So it should be some percentage of the CPI. The second largest answer category is at the bottom here, where 10 respondents felt that it should be pegged at the CPI plus some additional percentage that was more than 2%. So those were the answer categories we gave you. And remember, I would just sort of reiterate what Philip said, is that to some extent, this was a pretty artificial process. We didn't give you all of the possible choices, but this was really an attempt to get a temperature of the room. And so, bear with us on that. Number 4, we asked whether you would be in agreement with a potential combination of a fixed and variable cap. So remember, some cities have a cap that is set to the consumer price index, but they also have an upper or a lower level above which or below which the cap will never go. So that's a combination of fixed and variable. But 55% of you didn't feel that that was a good idea. The other 45% said it was acceptable. Question number 5, then we shifted to the issue of vacancy control. And the question was, should there be vacancy decontrol in some form? And 54% of you agreed that there should. 46% were against vacancy decontrol in some form. The next question then followed up on that, which is we asked whether if there is vacancy decontrol, do you favor a partial decontrol or a complete decontrol? So a complete decontrol is where owners are able to increase the rents as much as they want when there is a vacancy. And partial control allows for an increase above the cap, but is limited in its amount. And 58% of you were in support of some limit of a partial vacancy decontrol. Question number 7. In some cities, vacancy decontrol is allowed, but only under certain conditions, such as the level of maintenance or a statement from the previous tenant that they were not pressured to move out. So assuming that the program has some form of vacancy decontrol, should that decontrol be conditioned on any factor? And again, here we didn't identify which factor, we just are trying to get a sense of whether there should be conditions on vacancy decontrol. And 58% of you agreed that there should. The other 42% were against that idea. Question number 8 was, the current ordinance calls for a process of allowing a reasonable rate of return. Do you favor this method of allowing the potential pass-through of extraordinary costs? 81% of you were in agreement with that. The other 19% were not. So you can see that distribution. Then we asked about specific questions related to pass-throughs. The first one was, assume that there will be pass-throughs and that they are amortized, right? So that the amount is divided over a number of months. And the question 9A was, do you prefer a system whereby the owner can pass through 100% of the costs amortized, or whether you support a system where only a portion of the costs can be passed through? And 55% of you were in favor of a system of pass-throughs where only a portion of the costs, so that those costs are shared by renter and owner. 9B.
Ed, sorry.
Yes.
There was a clarifying question of the response rate. What was the response rate from members of the task force?
Okay, thank you. Thanks for monitoring that, because I can't see it. So we got a range of answers to specific questions, but mainly it was, there are 41 of you in the group, and we were getting answers in the range of 36 to 38 for most questions. So there were 3 to 5 of you that didn't answer these questions. So it's most of you.
So 80 to 90%
Yeah.
response rate. Okay, thank you.
All right. All right, so here the question is, assume that there are amortized pass-throughs. Which of the following do you prefer? 58% of you expressed a preference for an upper cap to the total rent increase, even when there is a pass-through. So again, a situation where the cap can be exceeded for special costs, but is limited at some top level. So 58% of you were in favor of that, and 42% felt that there should be no upper cap when a pass-through is approved. The next question again talks about pass-throughs and amortized pass-throughs, and we asked if you prefer that the pass-throughs be the same for all building types, or whether they be differentiated, whether large buildings should have different rules than small buildings. And 61% of you were in favor of a single set of allowable pass-throughs for all buildings, so that they would be the same for all buildings. Then the last question on pass-throughs was whether pass-throughs should be conditioned on other factors. All right, so this echoes that earlier question that we had about vacancy decontrol, which is, should we allow pass-throughs only when some factors have been met, such as compliance with building codes, safety, health, etc. 58% of you, however, felt that pass-throughs should not be conditioned on other factors, and the other 42% of you felt that they should. Question number 10 was about banking. Should owners be allowed to bank preferential rents? 61% of you were in favor of banking, and 39% of you are opposed to it. Question number 11 then, assuming there is banking, should there be a limit of any form to the amount that is banked and then cashed in by the property owner? And 2/3 of you, 66%, felt yes, that there should be some limit to the amount that property owners can bank. And again, we didn't get into the specifics about what that limit would look like. Question number 12, should the program exempt rental units in buildings with 4 or fewer units? All right, so this is the small building exemption, and 57% of you were against that idea, and the other 43% were in favor. Should the program exempt rental units only if the owner lives in the building? So here's the owner occupation exemption, and 2/3 of you were against that idea as well. So 66% said no, and the other third said yes. Question number 14, should the program exempt rental units in single-family homes? And 63% of you were against that idea, and the other 37% were in favor of it. Question number 15, assuming the program has a new construction exemption, which approach do you prefer? And 70% of you prefer or favored a rolling construction exemption based on the number of years since construction. The other 30% of you wanted to tie the exemption to a specific date and exempt all buildings built after that date. So 70% in favor of a rolling exemption. Question number 16, assuming that the program has a rolling exemption for new construction, which do you prefer? And 52% of you were in favor of a rolling exemption that was less than 10 years. And then you can see the distribution of support for the other 3 choices that we offered, which was a 10-year exemption, a 15-year exemption, and a 20-year exemption. Question number 17, do you support an exemption for assisted housing units where rents are based on a percentage of tenants' incomes? And again, this was similar to what is in the current ordinance. 92% of you were in favor of that, and 8% were opposed. Question number 18, do you feel that some form of a rent board should be created to administer the ordinance and preside over disputes and petitions? For example, the consideration of requests under the reasonable rate of return. And 57% of you were against that idea. The other 43% were in support of the creation of a rent board. And then, assuming there is a rent board, we asked you how it should be filled. And under those circumstances, 2/3 of you were in favor of an appointed board, and 1/3 were in favor of an elected rent board. And so that takes you through all of the questions that we asked of you a couple of weeks ago, and your response. I will put this document in the chat now so that you have it to refer to. But I think what we'd like to do is repeat the process that we went through in the first half of our meeting, which is to break you into small groups and give you an opportunity to discuss this information. Now, this information, there were more questions, and there was a greater variety of opinions expressed. And so I anticipate a little bit more of a meaty conversation in some of the small groups. But we'll move to that format now. And Trupti, have you put in the link to the Google Doc?
I did. I just put in a link to the Google Doc in the chat. Hopefully everyone can see that. And then Ed, how long do you want the rooms to be?
So we have a half an hour left before 3 o'clock. So I don't know. Do we want to spend 15 minutes in small groups and then 15 minutes for the full group report, or something close to that? Let's shoot for 14. There's going to be more conversation here, so let's go with that. Let's try 13 to 14 minutes in, and then it'll give us about 13, 14 minutes out, and then enough time to wrap up. Okay.
All right. Here we go.
Ed, do you need me to send you to a breakout room?
I just had to come out to put the document in the chat, and so now I'm going back to breakout room 5. See ya. Welcome back, everybody. I think we're all back from the small groups. So I think we should try to do what we did the first time around, which is to have each group sort of report back briefly. We're at 2:49. I would hope that folks could be efficient in their reporting back. Why don't we start this time with the other way around, group 6?
I can do that if folks are okay, and feel free to jump in. We had some sort of big picture comments, and then some other smaller picture comments. One thing that we noted is, because this is a relatively small group, that a few people could, one or two changing of minds can really push the percentages, right? Whether we're talking about 60 or 75 or 90 or whatever thresholds we're talking about, right? That one or two people moving matters, and that's going to affect the results. We talked about thinking about holistically around a policy rather than individual parts separately, which again we've already discussed is I think where we would like this group to move to eventually. Questions around what is driving differences of opinion beyond merely kind of the property owner side of recouping investment and renters wanting to keep rents low. What are some more specific concerns or reasons why different groups might be pushing for specific parts of the ordinance? I think would be helpful to know kind of the thinking behind that. And then questions around as well, like, what does this look like in the context of a local context? And what does the rental data say about about St. Paul and how that should inform the discussions moving forward? So thank you. And anybody else from 6 can jump in as well.
All right. Thank you, Tony. I was in group 5, and so I think the first thing that we talked about, one of the first things we talked about, is that it seemed to be only 1 or 2 items where there was a big majority in the 80s or 90s. Most of the others were in the 50 to 60% range, and in the 50s, that's essentially half and half. But then we also made the same observation that you mentioned, Tony, which is that, well, we're only a group of 41, and so 1 or 2 people can shift the percentages importantly. So there was that acknowledgement as well. I think members of group 5 saw some evidence there in the responses of people trying to find common ground. The overwhelming support for reasonable rate of return was interpreted as an attempt to accommodate multiple perspectives. Somebody also pointed out that the vacancy decontrol but limit it is another sort of example of trying to seek a kind of balance or middle ground. There was some surprise about the lack of support for owner-occupied exemption, single-family home exemption, and small building exemptions, but it was a good conversation, and people, I think, were energized by seeing these numbers. So I would ask then anyone else in group 5 if they want to chime in. Otherwise, we'll go to group 4.
I'll report for group 4, and other members, please feel free to jump in. We started with just sort of overall reactions, which were positive. We're making progress that we can see in these results, echoing that it's a nuanced picture and that there appears to be a fair amount of middle ground, but then also the challenges of navigating simplicity versus complexity in how we deliberate and make recommendations going forward. The potential areas of agreement that we saw, needing to look at it further, but on initial look, in addition to ones that have already been mentioned, which I won't repeat, which were maybe not wanting a rent board and maybe being open to a variable rate at different levels relative to the ones that were mentioned before, but on a list of potential areas. And then kind of everything else somewhere in the middle as open questions. Anything anyone in group 4 wants to add?
All right, thank you, Philip. Group 3.
Yeah, this is Robbie. I'll speak for group 3. We had a good discussion. We looked at the kind of focused in on the areas of the survey where it seemed like there was the most consensus, and we noticed that happened where reasonable rate of return on pass-throughs was concerned. We found it spoke a bit about the fact that there was seemed like there was a bigger aversion to not having a rent board. However, if there was a rent board, it would be best to have it appointed. We talked about vacancy decontrol and had a bit of an interesting discussion about, you know, if let's say you have, let's say banking is allowed, would that, you know, allowing banking, would that then, and please anyone from the group correct me if I'm wrong, but I felt our conversation was talking about if banking's allowed, then would that negate the need for vacancy decontrol happening? So just kind of, we were having a discussion about how these different scenarios kind of interchange and relate to each other and how they would affect each other. We also spoke about the variable cap, how that's going to be determined. You know, I had mentioned how other cities seem to be adding higher percentages onto the up and beyond the CPI. Then we also just noted that it was good to see that there was a really big consensus on the exemption for housing assistance where rent is based on tenant income. There was a question there on if that was federally not allowed anyway, but I think that's not the case. So it was a good discussion.
Great. Thank you, Robbie.
Yeah.
Group 2.
That may be the group that we are in. I don't think we appointed a person. So I'll just generally put out there, of course, folks, and put their other thoughts out there. I feel like we sort of talked a lot about just, you know, making sure that we're hearing more specifically from different folks' positionalities, sort of the thought around knowing how it affects developers, landlords, and the banking side. Correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, that's generally who I thought you're pointing that towards, but of course from renters as well too. But folks, I think generally saw that there was some agreement around areas around like the cap. I think folks brought up this idea around whether to have this rent stabilization for subsidized properties. But there's other discussion just generally about that it's about the total package together. Sort of different folks can live with different individual items, but it kind of depends on how other items are sort of shaped up. So I think the example that Rich brought up was, you know, maybe maybe you want to say this yourself, Rich. I saw you just come off the mic. So you can say that part if you'd like to.
Well, I think I actually sort of mentioned it earlier, right? One depends on the other, right? Can the community or can development or growth of the city of St. Paul live with a small cap if we have decontrol and banking? Can we live with a high cap if we don't have decontrol and don't have banking, right? So just whatever's there. The only other comment I'd throw in our group is that I think, you know, 3 of us talked about and 1 of us was silent on the idea of hearing again more from local experts. We just used an example in this group about the community first group, right? And the mayor specifically pointed back to that as a good example of how to get something done. That's something we learned locally here. So I think we also talked about in our group basically that we'd like to hear more from local expertise. We understand that sometimes they might have opinions, but we also think that just like everyone in this group, we're all being asked to be a little bit objective. So we would like to hear about more local expertise that knows our area. So,
as the person who is silent and didn't really get a second opportunity to speak, I will say that I disagreed with that.
Very good. I wanted to specifically mention it. I didn't know what your opinion was on it. Thank you.
Well, there we go. Those are the fireworks on to group 1.
Okay, group 1.
Our group, we agreed that, times are not easy for a lot of people in St. Paul right now. And, we do have to find more ways to make the situation more equitable and that people just have their basic needs met. We also need to come up, we all agreed that, everybody has a stake in this. Everyone has a stake in this being a success, whether you're a renter, whether you're a landlord, whether you're a policymaker, we all agree that we want a healthier, well-being community. A couple of the areas that we thought was on the vacancy control and the 3%, that those were kind of like the areas of, they thought, kind of like the areas of focus. One of the other comments was, implementation is going to be key, and then clarity. I think one thing that people did not know and wanted clarity is, when you use the term fair, right? What's fair for tenants and what's fair for landlords? So, figuring out what that really means. And then there was a discussion about small units versus large units. And then, overwhelmingly, we said, the group came back and it was like an aha moment for us. We're going to do the best we can here, but this isn't like set in stone forever. So whatever happens, there's going to have to be, a review of it to see how effective it is. And maybe it's an 18-month review and we move a cap number up or we move a cap number down. I think we'll start measuring it's been so hard because there's been so many data points across the country. And from being a chair, it's hard because everyone that gives you data that empirically tells you one thing, somebody else can give you data that sort of goes a different direction. At least that's the feeling I've gotten. So to be able to get real data from the city of St. Paul over the next, 12 months, 18 months, and 36 months, and to let this thing evolve so that we do get it right over time, and that, again, it ends up being something that we feel like is successful for everybody. So that was a real kind of like revolution to say that, we're going to try to get it right, but we have to put in mechanisms where it can be adapted over time, because the likelihood of everything we put into place being perfect is sort of unlikely because we don't know what we don't know.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Group One. I will give it back to Philip and Tony now to sign us off.
Yep, we're slightly over time. So we will have another packed agenda next week. I really appreciate everybody digging in this week. If you have other feedback and suggestions, contact me and Tony in between meetings. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. See you next week.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Have a great week.
Love St. Paul.